In November 2010, a small town on the fringe of the famous Barossa Valley is the scene of the most gruesome multiple murders.
People in Kapunda were scared. They were afraid that there was a killer in their midst, and they wanted to know who it was, why it was.
A family savagely murdered in their own home.
I can tell you without word of a lie, I have never heard anything as bad as the Kapunda triple murder. There is simply no comparison.
I mean, like, they were just good people. I just don't understand why someone would do this.
Destroying a family one after the other in front of their eyes, in their own home. There's no greater evil than that.
A town is left utterly stunned, whilst detectives struggle to find a motive.
What we had here was just a tragedy of epic proportion. He's sitting there skinny, weedy and weak, and I just could not believe that this was the person that had perpetrated 3 murders.
No emotion, no sorrow, no grief, no nothing. Just a very cold individual.
As 3 people lie dead, the killer would be tracked down in one of the most unlikely places, making this a crime that shook Australia. Kapunda, 80 kilometres north of Adelaide, is a small town once home to a bustling mining community.
Kapunda and the metal mine here is Australia's first commercial metal mine. It's a tourist attraction.
There are mines that you can still walk through, there are tours that you can go on, and to everybody else in South Australia, Kapunda is a low-level tourist destination. A little bit isolated as a result, and living that very stereotypical Aussie country life. You grow up with the group that you grow up with, you know them from birth through death, you take over a farm or you take over a business. On rare occasions you actually get out of the town and do something else, but you've always got that tie back there. And the bonds that form in communities like Kapunda are lifelong, sometimes whether you like it or not.
But the scene that is to unfold in Harriet Street on the morning of the 8th of November 2010 is one that the quaint tourist town has never seen before.
I was in my office going through a variety of files, and Senior Sergeant Steve Kinsman came into the office and said that they had 3 bodies had been found in the house at Kapunda. Someone else had found the crime scene. They'd contacted the local police, and there's only 2 police officers in that town. One of them attended and saw the scene. He had an ambulance arrive. He entered the house with an ambulance officer to determine that all those people in the house were beyond help and that they were deceased. The biggest crime prior to this, as far as anyone was aware of, was that someone set fire to Map the Miner, which was a symbol there.
An unprecedented scene confronted emergency services as the 3 victims sadly could not be saved.
I was hearing sporadic bits and pieces of information coming through from our investigative reporters, our police reporters, all of whom were trying to get information. What emerged very quickly was that police were keeping a very tight lid on the situation. They either knew completely what they were dealing with or had no idea whatsoever and were trying to keep things as tight as they possibly could while they sorted it out.
It's fair to say that that crime scene was very confronting. There's been some criticism by the media on that day that I didn't declare that it was a triple murder. Well, to be honest, until you get in and have a really good look, that can be a big call to make. And if you're going to tell a community that 3 people have been murdered and you don't know who is responsible for it, you better be sure that that's what you're telling them. You don't want it to turn out that it was a murder-suicide later on.
Information on the circumstances of the deaths was sporadic, but Grant Moyle and his colleagues needed to process the extent of the crime scene and uncover exactly what had happened.
First and foremost, who have we got in the house? Who lives there? And who's died in that house at that particular time? Are there any outstanding people? Early information was the names of the people involved and that their son was away in Queensland at that particular time.
The three victims are eventually identified as Rose and Andrew Rowe, and their 16-year-old daughter, Chantel. Their older son, Christopher, is on holiday on the Gold Coast.
While Christopher and his fiancée were up there, news broke of the murders. Christopher saw in the news coverage his street, posted a message on Facebook, "Can somebody check on my parents? That's my street." And they're talking about people being killed there. He got a reply back very early in the piece saying, "All's good." So he relaxed. But unfortunately that was misinformation. That person had mistaken which house it was, and in their effort to help Christopher, they'd given him the wrong information. Christopher then found out it was his parents and his sister. So of course, it went from being the dream holiday to the absolute nightmare.
Obviously, we had to clarify exactly when he'd left, and when we were satisfied that he certainly couldn't be connected to this, and try to get some background from him. Did he know of any people who might be responsible for this? Were there any other issues with the family that we weren't aware of?
I was just absolutely devastated for the family because they were friends of mine, and Christopher remains a very, very dear friend, and I will support him as long as I can.
As the only surviving immediate relative tries to take in the news, the police search for a motive.
What I will say is that yes, there was certainly a frenzied attack. Because of the nature of the scene, I think it was a very personal attack. And so I don't think it was just someone random. But that doesn't allay community fears, and certainly some fears from the beginning, and that was, did they have a murder on the loose in the town?
The Rowe family moved to Kapunda just a few years earlier, with Andrew running his own carpet cleaning business, and by all accounts had settled well into the community. Now viciously attacked in their home and left for dead, the police need to alleviate growing fears within the small town.
I was just devastated, but then I had to take a deep breath and say, right, we've got something on our hands here that we've got to manage and make sure our people are feeling safe.
As more details started to emerge about Andrew, Rose and Chantel Rowe, questions started being asked and rumours started coming out. And they were, as is typical for Adelaide, unfortunate and unfair rumours.
Some information was coming in about the family people were ringing up, and that information had to be followed up, a variety of different lines of inquiry. And for example, there was Andrew owned a large motorcycle that looked like a Harley Davidson, so there was some speculation of, is it bikey or drug related? Well, those things had to be ruled out. It wasn't even a Harley, so we ruled that out. But it took a number of hours to do that.
There was a sense of, of angst in the town. I think there's no doubt about that. And like any smaller community, you're going to get the Chinese whispers and all of that. So that had to be managed also.
Of course, then we were talking to the local police and the local, the neighbours, etc., to try to get some of that other information. That was done through door knocks of the area.
As house-to-house inquiries begin and friends and relatives are questioned, an anonymous phone call is to reveal some alarming news.
Some information came in through Crime Stoppers that a person had read a post on Facebook where a person had written that they had done something terrible, didn't know how they could live with themselves, they were very sorry, and words to that effect. And that person lived very close to this crime scene, and also we could establish a connection with the family. And we thought, is this the man? Is he confessing on Facebook?
3 members of a family have been brutally murdered in the rural town of Kapunda, South Australia. Rose, Andrew and Chantel Rowe have suffered horrific injuries in a brutal and sustained attack. Now police have discovered a message on a social network site that could lead them straight to the killer.
A person had written that they had done something terrible, didn't know how they could live with themselves. Also, we could establish a connection with the family, and we thought, is this the man? Is he confessing on Facebook? So we very quickly then had to gather the troops.
Officers raced to question the man about his message on the social networking site.
We were all hoping that this was the answer, but you're never that lucky. As it turned out, yes, we did have a team go to the house he was spoken to, and it was clear that what he was talking about was a domestic argument, dispute that he'd had, and so we ruled him out.
As news filters back that this isn't their man, Grant Moyle learns the true extent of the victim's dreadful injuries.
Andrew and Rosemary have fought with the killer from the front of the house through to the back, and I would suggest fought valiantly during the attack. Chantel has suffered significant injuries. Chantel was stabbed 33 times, Andrew 29, and Rosemary 50 or more.
The intensity of the violence is hard to process, and more details will come to the fore. Just days after the triple murders, the team focus on people who could determine the family's last movements.
Rosemary and Andrew had gone away down to Adelaide Saturday night to a party.
Chantel had had a party, and at that party several friends had attended, and things had been going well.
I understand it wasn't a big party by any stretch of the imagination, but more a case of some friends over, a few drinks, watching TV, watching movies. We went and followed up and found those friends and interviewed those. Now, all of them were helpful. We didn't have any issues with any of them. They told us what we wanted to know, gave us some access to Facebook sites to have a look and clarify some points and get some more background. We did that.
The party is to provide South Australia Police with vital links to Chantel's partner and closest friends.
We spoke to the majority of those on the Tuesday, so the second day. During that process, a uniform officer was speaking to one of the many friends that the name Jason Downie came up.
Jason Downie is an 18-year-old Scottish teenager who emigrated to Kapunda with his mother and brother 6 years before. Having once attended the same school as Chantel, he knows her and her boyfriend.
A statement was taken from him that day. That is the first time his name came up, but it came up no different from anyone else's at that particular time.
Police are also keen to track the last movements of Chantel's partner.
Chantel's boyfriend had sent her a text message at 5:30 a.m. on the Monday morning to her phone, asking how she was because she'd been ill the day before. And he said he didn't receive a reply, but our inquiry showed that a return message was sent from that phone. But Chantel was out of credit on her phone, so the message went off into ether space and we've never been able to retrieve it. But we know the reply was sent. It could not have been sent by Chantel. It had to be sent by the killer. And so we had a look at Chantel's boyfriend in regards to that. Was he telling us the truth? But we were able to rule him out.
As Chantel's boyfriend is eliminated as a suspect, 4 days on, Grant Moyle addresses the growing media.
Well, obviously the offender is still outstanding, and I would suggest the offender or offenders should be considered dangerous. If anyone does know who they are or has suspicions about individuals, please contact police immediately.
And the forensics team discovers something crucial at the crime scene.
The fingerprint specialists moved through the house to take fingerprints. They were spraying a substance called amino black that brings up fingerprints on different surfaces. And they were spraying that on the back of the bedroom door of Chantel's bedroom, and they were targeting a certain area and happened to pick up one fingerprint on the edge of the door, and that was quite detailed.
This is potentially a significant breakthrough. A fingerprint that does not match the victim's could narrow their search for a suspect.
Obviously, we were hopeful that that would get an identification, and we got the word back the next day that, unfortunately, no, it wasn't on the national database, and so we had no match at that particular time. So that told us certainly told us that it wasn't any of the Rowe family.
The lack of a match on their system could simply mean the person has no criminal record. A frustrating result, but the officers press on. Meanwhile, friends, colleagues and residents continue to try and help with the investigation as the hunt for the cold-blooded killer intensifies.
At the end of that first week, sadness overtook the gossip and the speculation. People started to realise that what we had here was just a tragedy of epic proportions, an innocent family who had been absolutely slaughtered for no discernible reason.
Almost 7 days after the multiple stabbings, residents still fear a killer is on the loose, and detectives are desperate to find the culprit, when forensic officers provide another potential breakthrough.
On the 13th of November, we were advised that a DNA profile had been obtained from semen that was found on Chantel, and they had loaded that to the database, and unfortunately there was no match to it. Again, same with the fingerprint. It's great news, but just not quite what we needed at that time. But it certainly confirmed our thoughts that most likely Chantel was the key to this investigation and the relationships she had with other people.
The team now realise that this sexually motivated attack could be central to the killer's intention and start to focus on people associated with Chantel. Who could have any compulsion to murder a 16-year-old girl and her parents?
We had to then go about taking some samples from her male friends and to eliminate those of them having that DNA profile.
As samples are collected, one of the statements taken from a friend sets alarm bells ringing.
We were sitting in the command post and John was reading one of the statements and said, "Oh, let's have a look at this, there's just something not quite right about that." He started to give an alibi when he wasn't asked for one. He made some comments about not being invited to the party on the Saturday night, of not having a girlfriend, and really trying to come up with an alibi without being asked for one, trying to paint a picture. And we thought, we'll do a bit more work on this. That included ringing his place of employment to say, what do you know about this individual? He was visited on Sunday, and a DNA sample and fingerprints were taken from him. And he volunteered that without any problems.
This young man is Jason Downie. He freely offers to help with inquiries, but officers also notice something unusual.
Police officers had visited him and seen the cuts on his hands. Because of the nature of the attack inside the house, it would not be unusual for the offender to suffer some sort of injury as well. He said that he'd, at that relevant times, he was elsewhere. He was in Freeling, he was in Gawler, he was with another person. He had sustained the injuries to his left hand as a result of falling off a push bike.
With Downey's relaxed attitude and willingness to help, could the cuts be the result of a fall or something far more sinister? Officers have to wait less than 48 hours to find out.
At 9:30 a.m. on Tuesday morning, I got the phone call that the sample was a match to Downey.
In the old mining town of Kapunda, just outside Adelaide, a vicious killer is yet to be caught. Almost 1 week after a family has been slain in their home, the investigation team has just received their biggest breakthrough so far.
The sample was taken from Downey on the Sunday, and at 9:30 a.m. on Tuesday morning, I got the phone call that the sample was a match to Downey, which was just fantastic for us.
This is the turning point in the triple murder inquiry. The swab taken from Jason Downie matches DNA found on Chantel.
I felt that then was the time to move. We couldn't wait any longer. We were on very, very good ground. And so we made the decision, made the decision that day that we would arrest him that evening.
This apparently unassuming 18-year-old has potentially broken into a family home and attacked 3 defenseless people with a knife, inflicting over 100 wounds. Officers realize they must take their next step with caution.
We could march into his workplace and arrest him there, but there's other people that work there. He's a mechanic, he's in a workshop. What weapons or other things were there? If he ran off, what might be the consequences of that? If we went to his home to arrest him there, might he, if his mother was home and there was another woman who lived there as well, might he take them hostage? I didn't want to alert him that we were about to take that step because we didn't want to endanger anyone else.
Officers set about planning a way to get to their number 1 suspect.
We had asked a number of people to come in and sign their statements throughout this investigation. He had one there unsigned, so we decided we'd ask him through his manager to drop in on his way home and sign the statement. He was dropped off at the station and informed he was under arrest.
Armed with the DNA results of the testing of the semen and of the fingerprint, 8 days on from the violent murder of Rose, Andrew and Chantel Rowe, South Australian police urgently question one teenager who might be the key to it all. With this powerful forensic evidence, what would Jason Downie reveal?
He said that he'd had consensual intercourse with Chantel some months beforehand. It was explained to him that that couldn't account for the way we'd found the DNA sample, but that seemed to just be dismissed by him. He offered an explanation that he had been at Chantel's boyfriend's place for a while, had left there and driven down to Gawler to McDonald's, had done a number of different things, visited different people, and came back. He'd come back home, he'd had an argument with his mother, and his mother locked him out of the house. So he had to sleep in the car that night. And it was shortly after 11 p.m, as I understand it, that he had that argument and was forced out of the house.
Chantel's boyfriend informed Jason that he wouldn't be staying over at Chantel's house that night. She was ill. She wasn't going to be going to work the next day. She had a bit of a cold. Downey knew that he was not going to be there that night.
But he came up with an excuse that he'd, at the relevant times, he was elsewhere. He had sustained the injuries to his left hand as a result of falling off a push bike first, and then later he told someone else it was falling off a motorbike.
Downey's alibi isn't adding up, and he has no real explanation for his DNA being found on one of the victims' bodies. As they press for more answers, detectives are keen to let Christopher Rowe know of the latest developments.
As soon as Downey had been arrested, I went around to his home with our victim contact officer and informed him that someone had been arrested and what charges were laid.
As the slightly built teenager faces serious charges, Christopher Rowe now has to brace himself for seeing the alleged killer of his family in court.
The Elizabeth Magistrates Court's interesting because it's home to a lot of low-level crime. I thought they'd brought up the wrong person. I thought they'd brought up some skinny little drug dealer that had been caught on a street corner selling meth to some kids. But no, that was him. I turned around and I looked at the faces of the family members of the Rowes who had come to the court case, and I knew it was him. The hatred and malevolence and grief pouring out of their expressions told the whole story. They knew who he was, and already they had some sense of what was going on.
Once that person was arrested for the crime, I think that's when the community started to get back to some type of normality. I mean, there's probably many that didn't, but I think by and large, I think most people thought, right, that's it.
Jason Downie maintains his innocence during a number of appearances in court.
It was supposed to be 6 weeks. It took over a year. Part of the reason it was blowing out was because the police were continuing their investigations. They wanted to make sure they had everything locked down tight. The other part was Downey himself. What we didn't know at the time was that Downey had started calling his mother and calling his brother from jail, writing them letters and talking about the fact that he didn't do it. The police had come across that correspondence with Downey's mother, with Downey's brother, where he blamed a man in the dark clothing with the green shopping bag, where he claimed, "Oh, I fucked up, Mum. I was in the house and I cradled Chantel as she died, but I didn't do it, and I should have told the cops. I'm so sorry." From my understanding, what the police were trying to do was make sure they had DNA evidence locked down, they had fingerprint evidence locked down, footprint evidence, any circumstantial evidence that could put Jason at the house at that time, talking to witnesses about his attitude, talking to people about his obsession with Chantel, scouring his Facebook page, his Bebo page, his internet usage for connections to Chantel, his text messages, his use of his phone, all of those pieces of evidence that would paint the picture of someone that would do anything to be in a romantic relationship with Chantel, to eliminate these ridiculous claims that he was making of a man wearing dark clothes, carrying a green shopping bag, running out of the house, to counteract his claims of, "I was there and Chantel died in my arms, but I didn't do the murder." Anything that could put those knives in his hands at those times. And that was a lot of pressure for them, and they had to get that locked down tight.
Whilst trying to prove Downey's claims are false, South Australia police also uncover more damning evidence against him.
What we did recover from the scene was a digital camera on the kitchen table, I think it was, and we examined that and found the photos of a family lunch that they'd had together, the Rowes had had together on the Sunday afternoon. Those photos proved great evidence because Chantel was holding a USB stick at that time. We were to find the USB stick in his bedroom at his home address and a lanyard to it in his vehicle, I believe. We also found some blood staining on the console of his car that was to be Rosemary and Andrew Rowes. We were able to determine through the examination of the laptop that there'd been a failed login on Chantel's laptop sometime after she was murdered, and that there was some blood staining on the keyboard, but unfortunately not sufficient enough for us to get a DNA profile from.
And the bloody fingerprint found on Chantel's door has finally come back as a match to Downey. More than 1 year on from the tragedy comes one of the biggest turning points in the case so far.
He finally pleaded guilty. I think it came as quite a shock to the system.
In one of the most horrific cases to hit South Australia, Jason Downie has been under the microscope as damning evidence links him to 3 of the most brutal murders ever witnessed in the country.
It's something that I think everyone's going to have nightmares over for many years to come.
Now, in a revelation, the suspected murderer, who has claimed his innocence all along, shocks the court.
He finally pleaded guilty, and as it would transpire, that he pleaded guilty 1 year and 1 day after the actual crimes. On each occasion, Christopher had attended, and quite a number of the other relatives and friends had attended those court cases.
It's very hard for both families to have lived with this moment. We're all getting through it. We hope he gets what he deserves.
It was a long process for them and a traumatic process for them.
Downey pleads guilty to the 3 murder charges. Shortly following the anniversary of the tragedy, the family and friends of the victims must now listen to the harrowing details coming out in court.
When a person pleads guilty in a South Australian court, the role of the judge changes to a finder of fact, because a judge must determine a penalty appropriate to that exact crime. The prosecution had no choice but to go through the evidence and, pardon the pun, blow by blow. And that was when everybody concerned with the case got an idea of just what had happened in that house that night.
For the first time, the circumstances surrounding that horrific night are laid bare for all to hear.
He gave an account through his lawyer about what happened that night. I don't accept everything that he said. He has certainly stood in the bath at some stage before the attacks have taken place because of the nature of the shoe print that was there. Whether he actually came in through that window or not, I'm not 100% convinced, but nonetheless he certainly has been in there at some stage. He gave an account of Chantel being attacked first and then having to murder the parents as a result so that he wouldn't get found out.
One of the knives from the Rowe family kitchen became involved, and Andrew was stabbed in excess of 20 times. He was stabbed so many times and with such force that pieces of the knife broke off in his body. There was then a confrontation, according to the court's accepted version of events, with Rose. And again, another knife was introduced. She was stabbed multiple times. She would go on to be stabbed in excess of 50 times by the time that the murder had concluded, but this was sadly the first set of stabbings for her. After they fell, the court ruled that Downey moved into the bedroom.
The poor girl was underneath her bed bleeding from what's been described as a free-flowing wound and has been dragged back out from under the bed and further attacked.
He placed her on top of the bed. He then continued to stab her. In the end, it was 33 different wounds. Then stripped her of her clothing, redressed her, left her on the bed.
After a frenzied and prolonged attack, Downey feebly attempts to cover his tracks and then decides to continue his merciless rampage.
The thing that has always struck me the most about this is that at least 2 members of that family knew someone they loved was being murdered while they were there. And she died having listened to both of her parents be killed and then undergoing that insidious torture herself. It just defies belief.
After an initial attack, he's attempted to clean up some of the crime scene and he's attacked them again. And we know that by the nature of the crime scene.
He tried to mop around Andrew and paused to stab him several more times. It's believed that he then noticed that Rose was still alive and was trying to make her way to the door. And he proceeded to deliver the last of the 55 stab wounds that she would receive until she was dead. At that point, Jason gave up on trying to clean up and left bloody sock prints as he ran out of the house. Nobody saw him leave. All that anybody heard was Rose screaming help 3 times and a noise like something falling over.
Prior to him being sentenced, he, through his solicitor, gave directions on where the shoes he was wearing could be found, and it was the local police officer who followed those directions and eventually found them, and which wasn't far from the murder scene. Then he tried to give directions on where he'd hidden his clothing, the weapons, and some clean-up items, because he cleaned up and took those items with him. We took him out of custody just before he was sentenced and spent a day travelling around that area. We were only ever able to recover some clothing of his. We never found the knives.
This detailed account of the level of violence has to be released for the court to hear. Family and friends also have to endure information about Downey's unbelievable actions after he has murdered Andrew, Rose and Chantel.
He's never shown any remorse throughout this whole process. I mean, if you look at his actions after the murder, the night, he's left the scene, he's gone off, he's disposed of his shoes, he's disposed of some clothing, he slept in his car that night. He's attended work the next day, albeit slightly late. Pretended he didn't know anything about it until supposedly hearing it on the news that afternoon, then feigning grief, having to go home early, and then not being able to work the next day because of his grief.
And the cover-up doesn't stop there. Downey is also filmed attempting to show his alleged grief in a very public manner.
He's laid a card and teddy bear at the back gate of the house where a lot of people laid tributes, and he's just played the normal local in grief about what has happened.
Here's a way of people paying him attention, but I've got an excuse that I can go with to get me out of it, so that you don't think really that I'm the killer, but maybe you'll talk about me a little more. Buy a little grey teddy bear, one of the Friends Forever brand, take it, stop, pause, look longingly at the memorial, make sure you know that the camera's filming you at that point. It's like out of a movie scene. He was composing this in his head. That was his dramatic moment, and he was taking full advantage of it. But also it's an excuse, because if I went back there and left a memorial, clearly I didn't do it.
He's mixed with these people during that whole week, even with Chantel's boyfriend. I just don't know how he could do that.
This window into Downey's psyche is also evident from stories of his behaviour whilst in custody.
He considered himself the big man, chest puffed up, walking around. I did the Kapunda triple murders. I did those killings. That was me. I was in court today. Big noting himself. Now, I'm sure some of that was fear, because again, 52 kilograms in a South Australian prison filled with pedophiles, bikers and killers, you'd want to be looking out for yourself very quickly. The family was steeling themselves for a long trial, so were the police, and so were the media.
After a gruelling process lasting more than a year, with all the facts scrutinised, the judge finally delivers his long-awaited sentencing in one of the biggest criminal cases to hit South Australia.
He calculated that Downey deserved a sentence of 35 years, one of the highest in South Australian history. Downey barely reacted again. It wasn't that he didn't care, I think he just didn't understand. I don't think he has the intelligence needed and the insight needed to understand how long 35 years really is. That it's longer again than he's been alive. And that when 35 years expires, he's not necessarily going to get out.
For closure, for the family and everything else, it needs to be. And he was obviously guilty. There's no question in my mind about that.
The sentence provokes an emotional reaction from the victim's family.
Please explain to me the justice in this. This is not a justifiable offence. He cannot return my family to me, so why should he have the right to any definition of life?
He pleaded guilty on this occasion and strung it out as long as he could because he knew the evidence against him was overwhelming. Not because he felt bad for what he did, but he knew, what's the point? Now, if I plead guilty now, I'll get a discount to some degree, which he did.
As the family tried to process the outcome of the sentence, Sean Fuster learns of another rumour that threatens to cause even more pain.
My editor said to me, "Sean, was Chantel pregnant?" No. Was it ever suggested she was pregnant? No, not in court. There was a rumour way back at the very beginning, an ugly rumour, but the cops knocked that down within the first week, boss. Why? Newspaper just splashed all over their website that she was killed and she was pregnant. I couldn't believe it. I thought, this family has dealt with enough. And I went tracking down the stringer that had written it. And I said to him, "Where do you get off? It's been publicly knocked down. It wasn't mentioned once in court. How could you possibly attach that?" "Oh, well, I thought it would be interesting." What I said to him next is unrepeatable. It's undoubtable that Jason Downie is extremely immature. He was raised with no male perspective on his life, no father figure. He had a stepfather, but that was much later in life, after he and his mother and brother moved to Australia from Scotland, leaving his older sister behind.
As Downey begins his sentence of more than 3 decades without his freedom, he decides to write a letter attempting to apologise for his crimes.
The biggest sign of Jason's immaturity was the letter that he wrote, which, to my mind, is the single most inexplicably inadequate apology that's ever been committed to paper. It's juvenile. The handwriting is juvenile. There are loops for eyes, there are missing words, there are random capitalizations, there are spelling mistakes all through it. And he apologises for my recent actions and how sad he is that he no longer has a car and a career. There's no perspective, there's no insight. He may very well be sorry in a limited way, but he doesn't understand fully what he's done. Just that incredibly blinkered, narrow understanding of what he's done and the tragedy that he's perpetrated.
I think, in due respect, there's a lot of hurt out there that we didn't know about. A lot of people probably grieving a lot more than we suspect and probably still are. And that's why we have this ongoing respect and we're careful in how we go about talking to anybody in relation to it now.
The lives of Chantel, Rose and Andrew Rowe have been taken in the most cowardly and unimaginable way. The murderer is to serve the majority of his adult life in prison. But for those left behind, the main question still lingers. Why did Downey go to the lengths of killing a mother, father and their young daughter?
His goal was to have Chantel, whether that was emotionally, whether it was physically, whatever it took. Being confronted by Andrew, probably being told something along the lines of "get out, you little freak," or "what the hell are you doing in my house?" being questioned, caused the snap. I don't think this was premeditated in the sense that he went there with the intent to kill, but he was prepared to do whatever it took to make Chantel his that night, up to and including murder in a way that he hadn't prepared for consciously, but something in him was clearly prepared to do. His lawyer said to the court, "I can't give Your Honour an explanation for what happened. My client doesn't remember it. He snapped into a fugue state." And the court has to ask itself how a person of his size, of his nature, with no criminal record could possibly do something like this. The prosecution had a very easy answer for it. It's very simple, Your Honour, he's a liar. He's a liar and he's a coward and he's a vicious brute. That's it. The motive's as old as time itself, simple jealousy, and he snapped.
Derek Percy is an Australian criminal vilified by every person who knows his name.
Police have spent the day interrogating the man they believe is responsible for some of Australia's most notorious child murders.
We're talking about some of the most mysterious crimes in the last century. Percy is a person who has excited a great deal of media interest.
Hitting the headlines over 40 years ago for a crime that changed the very fabric of Australian society.
His actions and the way he dealt with the young girl were horrific.
Maybe it's the first time people started to look at strangers a different way. It was certainly the time when Australia lost its naivety.
The graphic murder of 12-year-old Yvonne Toohey was only the start, as more heinous crimes unravelled, directing suspicion to Percy.
Percy is also a suspect in the disappearance of Adelaide's Beaumont children.
There can be nothing worse than the random abduction and murder of children, of which Percy is a suspect not in one but in several cases.
And would sensationally culminate in detectives questioning him on his deathbed.
Did you abduct and murder little Sue?
The notoriety surrounding one of the country's most evil killers, and the mystery that shrouds him to this day, makes this a crime that shook Australia. Derek Ernest Percy, from Mount Beauty, Victoria, is a man who has puzzled officials for decades.
Derek Ernest Percy is one of the most peculiar criminals we've got in Australia.
A criminal who has slipped into the shadows ever since a day that changed history in 1969.
The day, of course, was a Sunday. It happened that on that particular day, we found out during the afternoon that a little girl had disappeared down near Frankston.
The girl reported missing is 12-year-old Yvonne Toohey.
Yvonne Toohey had gone with a friend called Shane Spiller to a beach.
The two young children are in the quaint coastal town of Warneet, Western Port Bay, 55 kilometres southeast of Melbourne. Close to the water, they decide to play on one of the many beaches that surround them, just yards away from Yvonne's home.
Warneet is an area of bushland and beachfront outside of Frankston, not a terribly popular area, and in the middle of winter, July, an area that people don't visit a lot. They drive past it, but they don't stop there too often.
But today, the young friends are not alone on the beach. As they innocently play, everything changes within seconds.
Shane was with the little girl Yvonne when a fellow approached them, grabbed hold of Yvonne and insisted that Shane come to her rescue and threatened that if he didn't come over that Yvonne would be injured.
As the children stand terrified, the stranger tries to also snatch Shane. But the little boy reaches for a small axe he has brought with him.
He was astute enough to pull a little tomahawk out of his backpack and run off.
Shane Spiller flees to get help as his friend is dragged away and into a nearby car.
He signalled down a passing motorist, so he was able to provide a good deal of detail, which is pretty smart for a child under those circumstances.
The search for the vulnerable little girl is now paramount. Officers are relying on Shane and any other witnesses to stand a chance of getting to Yvonne.
He was able to describe the guy, he was able to describe the car. When Shane was asked about the car, the most significant thing that he was able to tell us was that there was a Navy sticker on the back of the car. He was able to tell us what colour it was. He was able to tell us it was a little station wagon, and with the aid of the other passers-by, they were able to give us a colour, and it was described, I think, as a Hillman. Somebody else was able to provide that it had New South Wales plates on, and being in the state of Victoria, of course, that made it much more meaningful. Other witnesses were in the same area, so the car had attracted some attention.
And one particular witness provides information that indicates the abductor is planning to take Yvonne to somewhere secluded.
He came forward and he described having seen a car being driven erratically along a dirt road in that area.
Officers widen their search for the sighted vehicle. As each minute goes by, they fear for Yvonne's life.
I guess it doesn't become much more pressurised than in being told that a 12-year-old girl has been abducted from the beach. Nobody knows where she's gone. She was last seen by a little boy who saw a man holding a knife to her throat. So in terms of pressure, in terms of doing what you do as a policeman, it doesn't get more meaningful than
that. As an extensive search begins, Yvonne's friend Shane and other members of the public provide crucial information, and one clue in particular proves to be invaluable.
There are a lot of people who did a lot of right things on that day, not the least of them being the little boy. The passers-by did the right thing. The first police to attend did the right thing. The first police to attend went to Cerberus because of the sticker on the back of the car.
Cerberus is a naval base 35 kilometres south of Warneet.
The little boy was able to tell police that he saw a little Navy insignia on the back, so the police went to the nearby Navy base.
The sticker that Shane has described on the abductor's vehicle could be an essential clue in finding the perpetrator who has taken his close friend. Officers rush to the location 30 minutes away. Yvonne has not been seen for hours. As they arrive at the base, they discover something that will alter the whole investigation.
When the police first arrived at Cerberus, they quite quickly, with the aid of naval police, found the car that had been described.
But the officers need to be certain it's the same car they are looking for.
People, including little Shane, were able to go to the naval depot and pick out the car from the many, many cars parked in the car park at the naval depot. It was not at all difficult for the naval people to identify the owner of the car. They had the records well compiled.
The owner of the orange estate car is Derek Ernest Percy. As officials try to locate him on the base, his vehicle is searched for any possible clues.
He was a 20-year-old naval trainee. He was an electrical fitter, I think. The naval base at Cerberus is a major naval attachment. It's where young naval officers go to be trained to take on their role in the Navy. And Percy was a cadet naval officer.
It is now vital for officers to get to this cadet immediately to find any information on Yvonne's whereabouts.
They did look to get Percy to the office by piping him, I think was the expression, and he didn't respond. So they went to his barracks, and his barracks mates told the police that he was down doing his washing.
When the police get to the laundry facility, they make a very alarming discovery.
That's where he was when he was apprehended. He was washing his clothes.
They went in. A senior officer tried to stop them, but they burst in and they found Percy cleaning his blood-soaked clothes.
(1969), and 12-year-old schoolgirl Yvonne Toohey has been snatched by a vicious predator from a beach in Warneet, Victoria. After her friend memorizes the kidnapper's vehicle, officers have raided a nearby naval base and caught the owner in a very compromising situation.
He was washing his clothes. They probably had blood on them, but he had clothes in a washing machine, so we don't have a picture of somebody standing over a tub scrubbing blood out. It wasn't that graphic, but he was certainly washing his clothes, of course. Police took possession of his clothes, asked him preliminary questions, obviously, as to whether or not he knew anything, and he firmly denied that he did do anything or he knew anything or whatever, but he was taken into custody by the naval police people, and he was isolated until such time as we got there.
By now, Yvonne Toohey has been missing for over 5 hours. The possible blood on the clothes is a very distressing sign, and Percy needs to provide answers fast.
You make sure you got your facts right as best you can. Make sure you got whatever exhibits are available to you at that time as best you can. So with all that in place, that's when we first started to speak to Percy.
And worryingly, along with the blood-stained clothes, more incriminating exhibits have been found while searching his car and private possessions.
We had his clothes, of course, but the most meaningful exhibit was a blood-stained knife that had been found in his car. There were other knives found in his car. There were also sketches of nude children which we'd found on top of his locker. So there were those sorts of things that early pointed to him.
Detectives are now in a unique position. With extremely damning evidence, they must get Percy to reveal what these items are connected to. With nothing pointing directly to missing Yvonne, what would the young naval cadet reveal?
He had all sorts of reasons to believe that she was dead, at worst, or fatally injured. And the only person in the world at that time who could take us there was Percy. And here we were talking to him and trying to get him to tell us, trying to elicit this information from him, and it was very difficult. As we started to speak to him, he was in denial, but in terms of his demeanour, he was very quiet. He spoke in monosyllables. He wouldn't look us in the eye. He was almost tuned out, if you like. He was insisting that he might have done something bad, but he couldn't remember. I can remember Dick Knight and Percy speaking very quietly and very slowly. It was like watching two people trying to hypnotise each other, almost. Dick Knight was a very skillful interrogator. He had the ability to tune into a suspect and to meet him at the right level. He picked Percy. He knew what would work with Percy, and it did work.
After hours of trying to coax information from the suspect, Percy utters these terrifying words.
He kept saying, I might have done it, and I can't remember, I might have. And eventually he said, yes, I did kill her, and I can take you to her, she'd be dead.
Despite the breakthrough, Bernie Delaney was stunned by Percy's next remark.
He agreed to take us there, and as a mark of the man, when we said, will you take us and show us, he said, yes. Do I need a coat? Will I be cold?
On a winter's night, Victoria Police quickly scrambled to get to Yvonne, who has been missing for over 10 hours. And her family is anxiously waiting for any news.
We had little idea of what he'd done at that stage. So we went to the scene with forensic people, photographers, with an officer from the Navy, with our own inspector. When we got there, Knights insisted that only a couple of us go to where the body was because we didn't want to disturb the scene. So Percy simply took us to where the body was in the headlights of the car, and he showed us the body of the poor little girl stretched out on the wet ground. She was bound with her hands behind her back. She had a gag placed in her mouth which was tied in with a rope. She'd had her throat cut from one side to the other and she'd been disemboweled. He was pretty matter-of-fact about it all. I was close to him during that time and for the days that followed, and his demeanour never changed.
The details of this unbelievably sadistic crime are hard to absorb. 2 innocent children playing on a beach has now resulted in a young girl's life being taken. And the evil perpetrator appears to be remorseless. Following extensive interviewing of Percy in the coming days, officers will discover they are dealing with a criminal whose depraved mind goes beyond comprehension.
Police went back to Cerberus and they found in his possessions certain handwritten documents. We then, of course, had to put to him that perhaps he had done some of these things to Yvonne Toohey, and he admitted yes, he had.
Not only does this young man have the capability to murder in cold blood, but to also act out his extremely dark fantasies. Could there have been any warning signs from his past into this terrifying behaviour?
He was quite a normal young kid, probably a nerd, you'd call him in today's language. He collected stamps and he was top of the school until around about puberty, where he started to behave strangely.
Percy was very, very close to his mother.
There is some suggestion that his family started to become aware of Percy's bizarre behaviour at a young age.
But it involved things like Percy dressing up in women's clothing, violently stabbing women's clothing, this type of thing. At Mount Beauty in rural Victoria, where the family was living as he was a teenager, he was known as the local snowdropper, somebody that would, jump fences and take underwear from lines and things like that. So it was all quite bizarre, and especially in 1960s Australia.
Mrs. Percy would let the younger brother of Derek do what he liked, but with Derek, she would always say, "Where are you going?" and ask the friends to look after him. She went to the local doctor, and the doctor said, he's just going through a peculiar stage, he'll grow out of it. Well, he didn't. So he killed poor Yvonne Toohey.
Derek Percy admits to murdering and torturing the innocent girl. Yet the legal process that follows is one that most people would not have anticipated.
He was put before a jury of 12 peers, and the trial began. He was charged with murder. He'd pleaded not guilty on the grounds of insanity.
The only defence that could be run for Derek Percy was defence of insanity. That is, at the time of the killing, he was insane within the legal concept of insanity. And by the time I came into it, it was pretty clear that there had been a number of psychiatric opinions which confirmed the fact that he was insane at that time, in their opinion. And so I took the trial on the basis that's how it would be run.
Percy is assessed by a number of psychiatrists to determine his mental state.
There was a tremendous amount of material available to them because of his past history and his behaviour and the diaries that he kept. All of that was horrific stuff, but it was very important for the psychiatrist to examine all that. So there was a lot of psychiatric material. All the diaries and all his descriptions were all exhibited and read to the jury, and it was pretty horrific. In fact, my memory is that I think one of the jurors fainted during the opening address by the prosecutor. It was a shocking case. at least from memory 2 or even 3 psychiatrists expressed the view independently of each other that he was insane within the meaning of the law.
The disturbing content of Percy's private possessions discovered after Yvonne's murder reveal an extremely alarming insight into his macabre mind that officials now know have stretched beyond his imagination.
I can remember saying to somebody one day that a person who would write something like that has a problem, but when he lets you know that he's capable of carrying out, society has a problem.
The content of the fantasies Percy has written down are too graphic to detail, but one obsession shows the extent of his depraved mind.
He had a fascination with his own feces, and what made him even more unique was the fact that he involved his victim in that fascination. And a number of psychiatrists have said that in world terms that's very unusual for a person who's a coprophiliac to involve their victims in that predilection. It just shows how unique he is in world terms.
This is just one aspect of Percy's psyche that leads experts to believe he is not of sound mind.
In this case, there was no rebuttal evidence. No psychiatrist was prepared to say that he was not insane, in other words.
Percy may have fully admitted to murdering Yvonne, but the outcome of this unprecedented trial marks a unique point in Australian criminal history.
The jury deliberated for quite a considerable time, but finally came out with a verdict of not guilty on the ground of insanity.
Derek Ernest Percy, a 20-year-old naval cadet, has just been found not guilty of brutally murdering 12-year-old Yvonne Toohey. Despite confessing to the killing and taking detectives to the crime scene, he has pleaded insanity, and the jury have agreed. Now he is to be remanded under a different legal system.
In those days, the result was that he was to be detained at the governor's pleasure.
That is not a life sentence. It can be reviewed. And there have been a number of cases where people who've committed horrible crimes because of mental incapacity or psychotic episodes have effectively been cured.
No minimum tariff is set on Percy's detention. He is sent to Her Majesty's Prison, Pentridge. Yet more than 20 years later, his name comes to haunt the people of Australia once more.
So Percy's in jail, and that's where it would end, except for a young policeman by the name of Wayne Newman, who was given the job of just fixing up an old inquest brief for a little girl called Linda Stillwell, who had gone missing from the St Kilda beach in the late 60s. And Wayne started looking at the case. Slowly and methodically, he was able to work back and realise Percy was a suspect in the Linda Stillwell case and several other cases around Australia.
A number of brutal child murders and abductions remain unsolved from the 1960s. Could Derek Percy also be responsible for these?
In January 1965, during the school holidays, 2 next-door neighbours, schoolgirls, Christine Shorrock and Marianne Schmidt, took Marianne's 4 younger siblings to the beach. They lived in Western Sydney, and the only way they could get to the beach was by train. They hopped off at the train at Cronulla and they walked up to Wanda Beach, a very popular beach. So the children played in the shallows. But shortly after midday, the girls decided that they would go for a walk into the sand dunes. The younger children were complaining that they were tired, so the older girls made the decision to leave the younger children resting behind a sand dune. They never came back. A couple of hours later, the younger children decided that they would catch the train home and report the disappearance of the children to their parents. The tragedy unfolded the next day when the girls' bodies were found buried in a sand dune by a young man, a passerby, and the two girls had been badly assaulted, sexually assaulted.
New South Wales police question over 10,000 people in one of their largest investigations. Yet still, to this day, nobody has been found guilty of the girls' murders.
It looked to be completely a random attack. But why did the girls go into the sand dunes? They had been to that beach the week before, so police thought that they may have met somebody and agreed to meet up later that afternoon. They were seen with a 16-year-old boy. Now, whether or not this boy was involved, he's never come forward, he's never been identified as a suspect, but he does remain the person most likely to have been involved in that crime.
Officers compiled an identikit image from witnesses at the time and compared it to a photograph of Percy, who was 16 years old, and also had a connection with the area.
Would Percy be a suspect in that matter? Certainly. In fact, you'll find that he had a relative who lived very close to the station where the Wanda Beach girls hopped on to go to the beach.
It did come out that his grandmother lived in the adjoining suburb to the girls in Denniston in Western Sydney, which was an incredible coincidence. But whether or not Percy was there that summer, my investigation in speaking to family members doesn't confirm that.
However, decades later, in 2007, Victoria Police unearth a stash of Percy's belongings, hidden in a storage unit in Melbourne.
It's a set of material around videos, around other documents, handwritten notes, a whole set of material that we've become aware of has in fact been in that location for 20 years.
Within this substantial amount of material, including graphic drawings and notes, officers discover a map Percy has written on, showing an area near to where the attack happened. But he has never offered an explanation for this. Yet other inconsistencies cast doubt on his involvement. Interestingly, a key piece of evidence in the case could have potentially snared the culprit many years ago.
The tragedy of this crime is that there was a DNA sample. There was a sperm sample located on one of the girls' clothing. Over the course of time, and this is years before the advent of DNA technology, the sperm sample was mishandled and did go missing.
Christine and Marianne were murdered in broad daylight more than 40 years ago, both just 15 years old. Their horrific deaths remain a mystery to this day. Just 1 year on from the killings, Australia would be rocked by the disappearance of 3 siblings, the Beaumont children.
The disappearance of the Beaumont children in 1966 from a South Australian beach changed Australia, changed the way Australians parented. From now on, it was the end of innocence. Parents now kept a very close eye on their children.
Jane, Anna and Grant Beaumont took a short bus ride to the beach one summer's day, but never returned home. Several witnesses claim to have seen the siblings at the beach with a man.
The fact that there was thousands of people at a public beach, it was over 100 degrees in the old Fahrenheit scale. The children were seen playing with a man between 35 and 45 years old, 6 feet tall, slim build but athletic and tanned. The children played with him as if they knew him. He'd gained their confidence very, very quickly.
Yet despite this detailed information, the children vanished without a trace, and no one has ever been held accountable for their disappearance. Various people have become suspects over the years. Could Derek Percy have been the kidnapper?
When Derek Percy was interviewed over the murder of Yvonne Toohey, he spoke to a school friend who was a constable at the time.
Derek Percy's best childhood friend, Ronald Anderson, joined the police force just months before Percy was arrested for murder in 1969.
Ron Anderson asked him about a number of other unsolved crimes. When asked about the Beaumont children, Percy was evasive and he said, "I was there at the time." Now, whether or not he was, or whether or not he was just saying that to throw Anderson off the track, is not known. During the course of that summer, the children had been to the beach a number of times with their father. Their father had gone to work the day before and he had dropped them off to the beach. So it wasn't unusual, even though the children were only 9, 7 and 4, for them to be at the beach by themselves and to catch the bus home by themselves. So this person who did take them from the public beach had gained their confidence either within an hour or two, or maybe over the course of a number of visits to that beach over that summer.
Yet the man described by witnesses was middle-aged. Derek Percy at the time was 17 years old. Despite various leads over the years, the fate of the 3 siblings remains a mystery all these years on. South Australia police still keep the case open. Just 9 months after the Beaumont children disappeared, Alan Redston was brutally murdered in Canberra.
Alan had been tied with a rope and strangled, and his body dumped into a local creek. Now, when police tried to rule Percy out of that crime, it was found out that he was living 400 kilometres away at Mount Beauty. They thought that he may have been in Canberra visiting an aunt, so they couldn't rule him out. Also, one of the bindings that the boy had on his body was a school tie, and because Percy was a schoolboy, that was a red flag as well.
But as investigations continued, the chances of Percy being the perpetrator looked less likely.
It appears that there had been a number of bullying incidents over a number of weeks where children had been tied up. The Australian Federal Police are very confident that they interviewed the person responsible for Alan's death in the early days of that investigation, and that these bullying incidents were linked. His body wasn't affected post-mortem like Percy's other victim.
Australian Federal Police continue with that stance to this day. The violent murder and mutilation of Simon Brooke 2 years later, however, does bear some hallmarks of a crime Percy could have committed.
Simon Brooke was a shocking case. A 3-year-old boy playing in the front yard of his family home on a winter Saturday disappears. His body is found the next day in an adjoining block of land, and he had been strangled, and post-mortem he had been mutilated with a razor blade.
Wayne Newman was able to work out that Percy had been in the Navy, been a sailor, and was stationed up in Sydney. And his trip to the naval depot from his lodgings took him virtually straight past Simon Brooke's house.
He said that he was driving with his brother on the day of Simon's abduction and killing on that same laneway, near that same railway cutting.
Australia's most notorious child killer, Derek Percy, may have been incarcerated since 1970 after the death of Yvonne Toohey, but officials fear he may be responsible for many other unsolved abductions and murders across the country. And the horrific killing of Simon Brooke in Sydney points to Percy in more ways than one.
I found out that there was a boys' home a number of streets away from where Simon Brooke went missing. It's quite possible that the person responsible was scouting for victims among the boys' home when he came across little Simon Brooke playing in his front yard. The reason why Derek Percy has been associated with this crime is because he was stationed in Sydney at that time.
Wayne Newman and his colleagues at Victoria Police spent years reviewing the tragic case of Simon and built up a compelling link to Percy.
A very detailed inquest brief went before the coroner. The coroner recommended that brief to the Director of the New South Wales Prosecutions, the DPP, and the decision was made not to pursue that. There was not enough evidence to lay criminal charges in relation to that matter. So that was certainly a case that we thought that Mr Percy was strongly linked to.
Percy was a fella considered unfit to plead. Doesn't matter what you find out about him, he won't be charged.
Simon Brooks' family have had to endure the rest of their lives with uncertainty. In a recent statement, his father Donald gave his views. Just 3 months after the murder of Simon Brooke, 7-year-old Linda Stillwell is abducted just yards from her house in St Kilda. What connects Derek Percy to this crime?
We're talking about a very naive place in the 1960s. Kids were allowed to go out and play and come back at dark. And the little independent girl went across to the beach to play, as lots of kids did, but she didn't come back.
After playing with her siblings, Linda chose to stay near the beach while her brother and sister went home. When they went back to find her, she had disappeared.
Linda Stillwell is a lot like the Beaumont children. We have no crime scene, we have no forensics, we have 1 or 2 witnesses, we have no suspect.
Linda went missing the year before Yvonne was killed.
One of the thrusts was that Linda had potentially drowned. So investigators actually looked at tides and currents, engaged the appropriate experts in relation to that, and a line search was conducted all the way down to Brighton. They had the army involved. They were probing the soil and the sand just to see whether or not a little girl had been washed up. Detectives went door to door, just really to see whether or not had she run away, whether she'd got herself into sort of like any confined space that she couldn't get out and passed away there. They went to the extraordinary length of boarding all ships docked at St Kilda and down in the bay at the time to see whether or not Linda had been taken on board any of those ships.
Despite all of this, police officers at the time drew a blank.
Derek Percy was not even known to Victoria Police or any other law enforcement organisation at that stage, so he certainly wouldn't have been a person of interest at any stage back at when Linda originally disappeared.
Yet years later, when Wayne and his colleagues opened the files once more, they spotted alarming factors that could make Percy a suspect.
The thing that worried investigating detectives in regards to Percy was that he was on leave at the time, he was in the area, he was active, he committed the crime against Yvonne Toohey only 8 months later, and so he had a high propensity to be involved in that case. A couple of witnesses said that they saw a man with a dark complexion. That may have been Percy, we're not sure. Certainly matches Percy's height, he had that gaunt face.
When initially questioned about Linda, after he had killed Yvonne Toohey, Percy alludes to being in the area at the time.
Ron Anderson alleged Percy made comments such as he drove through St Kilda on the day that Linda disappeared, and Ron pursued that and said, well, you know, did you kill her? And he said, possibly, but I can't remember. And I've subsequently interviewed him, and he certainly has not made that admission to me.
However, amongst Derek Percy's belongings discovered in the lockup by police were maps of Melbourne.
Is that the atlas that you used to own? Yes. That you own, rather?
Certain areas, in particular St Kilda, where Linda was last seen, appear to have been drawn on. But when questioned, Percy hasn't shed any light as to why.
Do you recall making the markings on the map?
The case will only ever shut if the person responsible is charged, brought before the courts, or if we find some remains of Linda.
The little girl's family have battled for Percy to be forced to give evidence for many years, at one point resulting in an astonishing story that hit the headlines.
Percy was pursuing costs against Jean Priest for the court action, and in the end, fact is stranger than fiction sometimes, and we wonder if we have a justice system, but the courts found that yes, indeed, Jean Priest, this grieving mother, did owe Derek Percy, an imprisoned man, a killer, somewhere in the order of $80,000 in legal costs. And fortunately, the Attorney General in the state of Victoria, Robert Clark, stepped in.
The unbelievable action never stopped the family's fight. Yet this attempt to claim money isn't the only thing about Percy's incarceration that will enrage the public.
Because he was jailed for the Yvonne Tui killing, but he was not convicted, then under the Commonwealth legislation, he's able to continue to receive a naval pension. He's been able to be paid somewhere in the order of $300,000 plus in taxpayer-funded superannuation. He's been using this money to invest in shares, coins, stamp collections, this type of thing.
Throughout the years, Percy has attempted a number of appeals to be granted a minimum tariff, all of which have failed. Linda Stillwell's family continued to work with Victoria Police to push for an inquest in 2009. A relentless determination to make him provide information they feel he has known all along.
In recent times, Percy had attempted to be moved from the criminal justice system, from Port Phillip Prison, to the Thomas Embling Psychiatric Hospital. And that, I'm sure, Percy sees as his exit from a jail. Because he can argue that he has been convicted on the grounds of insanity, he should be held in a psychiatric institution, not a mainstream jail.
Ever since his original conviction, much debate has surrounded whether Derek Percy suffers from a psychiatric illness or not.
I don't believe he is insane. I do believe that he is. He has almost full recollection. I'm sure that there are killers that suppress facts and memories in order to survive themselves mentally. For killers like Derek Percy, there may be an ability to suppress memories in order to live with themselves.
And remarkably, when recently assessed once more, the findings were chilling.
The courts here have found that on modern psychiatric evidence that he doesn't have an identifiable psychiatric illness.
In a unique step, Percy was issued with a certificate in relation to the inquest into Linda Stillwell's death. Should he reveal anything, it would not be used against him. He chose to remain silent. And so the enigma surrounding this brutal child killer continues.
I don't think he's necessarily concealing these matters. Maybe he just refuses to allow himself. But there are telltale things in his diaries which indicates that there's still a flicker there.
He was a coward who preyed on children. He can't be forgotten because we need to learn from people like this so that our society is safer. It's much better to be proactive and preventative.
We can only hope that there was only ever one Derek Percy and that there are no others like him.
He's a killer, we know. How many times? We still don't.
Do you want to make any further comments, Mr. Percy?
No. No.
The 1st of March 2000 is etched on the minds of the people of Aberdeen, Australia, forever.
Never before, and really never again, has there been a crime of this nature actually perpetrated by a woman in Australia.
It's disgraceful. I I can't comprehend what she's done.
A murder so inexplicably heinous, it still affects all of the officers called to the scene to this day.
Nothing could prepare you for what you were about to see. Whatever had done this, it was obviously a monster, and we had to do something. We had to somehow finish it.
The gentleman's head had been located, so we're looking for that.
A woman driven to kill in a way that defies comprehension.
She's been branded a danger to the community, capable of murdering anyone who crosses her.
There's a pot on the stove. I think I might have even said, so I'll give you one guess where the head is.
I didn't eat meat for about 3 months.
The despicable crime committed by Katherine Mary Knight stuns the whole nation and leaves everyone searching for a reason, making this a crime that shook Australia. Aberdeen, in New South Wales, is a small town in the Upper Hunter region, around 3 hours' drive north of Sydney. Once known for its mining community and abattoirs, it now holds public fascination for a very different reason.
Aberdeen's the type of country town which has probably had its best years. The best years are probably behind it now. It was quite an industrial town.
Aberdeen is the perfect backdrop for a crime like this, I guess. You know, it's got the cliches. It's got the abattoir that's closed down and the grass is growing there, and it's got the coal train that runs through town occasionally, and the silo, and it's got the two pubs, the top pub and the bottom pub.
There are a lot of low socioeconomic issues that surround towns such as Aberdeen.
Whatever the makeup of the once thriving town, it could never have prepared for the horror that is to unfold in March 2000.
I was actually working at Muswellbrook that day and received a phone call at the station from a workmate of Mr. Price's.
We got the call from his boss to say that he hadn't come in and somebody had been out there and the ute was still in the driveway. They couldn't raise anybody. But, you know, not thinking the worst, oh yeah, he's probably tied one on or something and hasn't woken up.
John Price is a 45-year-old who works in the local mines. Scott Matthews and Graham Furlonger drive to Aberdeen to investigate further.
I knew Mr. Price before. I knew that he was a hard worker and reliable man, so it was a bit unusual for him not to turn up for work and not to make a phone call.
I went up, knocked on the door, didn't get an answer, saw some blood on the door jamb. Looked through a little gap into the lounge room, which was dark, reasonably dark, and saw what looked like a bunched up curtain hanging down. Couldn't raise anybody, so I decided we'd go and break into the place, seeing as we had this complaint. I walked around the side, there was a piece of meat lying on the ground, and anyway, went round the back, broke in through the back door. As we went in, I saw straight ahead of me what I thought was a curtain.
There was something hanging, blocking my entry into the hallway of the house. I thought it looked like some type of blanket or some sort of covering that had been placed up on the archway. So I remember I used my left hand to push it aside, and immediately I could feel coldness coming on my left arm. So I looked down and my left arm was just covered in blood. Initially I thought I'd injured myself breaking through the back door, so I couldn't understand why my arm was bleeding.
As Graham and Scott try to locate the missing man, they are suddenly faced with the most horrific scene ever to be witnessed.
I realised then it was a human pelt. It was the skin minus the head. A full skin just hanging from the top door frame. Looked past it and saw a torso on the ground without a head and without any genitalia. And I think my first reaction then was to turn around to Scotty and say, "Don't look, Scotty." Of course, that's the worst thing you could say.
I could look through there, from there into the lounge room, and I saw what appeared to be, a human being, or what was left. And so it was at that point that I'd realised, what had happened. For something that I'd never seen before, I'd never experienced, I had an immediate idea of what had gone on. It was at that point that I drew my service pistol.
There was blood everywhere. A line of blood out from the door into the kitchen area. There's a pot on the stove. I think I might have even said to Scotty, "I'll give you one guess where the head is."
The scene is beginning to resemble that of a horror film. Yet amidst the carnage, the police uncover what appears to be elements of normal domestic life.
On the table there was a couple of plates that had meals where he prepared vegetables and meat cooked, sitting there.
Sergeant Furlong, who was talking to him, he was saying, "Look, it's going to be all right, we've got to keep going, we've got to finish this, we've got to do whatever it takes." He was talking to me and I'm trying to hear if I could hear anybody else, because sometimes a little bit under stress, you get that auditory exclusion and you're not hearing things, you're just focused on the threat. It was quite a frightening experience, but once you've stepped into that situation, there's just no backing out.
As well as having to deal with a murder like they have never seen before, both officers still have no idea if the person who has carried out this slaying is still in the house.
So we went to search the place and we went up the hallway.
We heard what appeared to be someone snoring coming from one of the bedrooms, so we knew that there was someone alive in the house.
Looked in there and there she was lying on the bed.
In the sleepy town of Aberdeen in New South Wales, police officers have just uncovered a crime scene like no other. Having been called to check on a man who had failed to arrive for work, they enter his house to be confronted with a gruesome scene. Parts of his lifeless body lie in various rooms, whilst a woman appears to be sleeping in the bedroom.
I tried to wake her. She was obviously drugged on something and couldn't wake her properly. She was very groggy.
She wasn't responding, so we carried her outside and put her onto the back lawn. I wasn't sure whether she'd tried to kill herself with sleeping pills or whatever, but she certainly wasn't injured in any other way.
The woman who is unresponsive is 49-year-old Katherine Mary Knight, known locally to be the partner of John Price. Having taken what appears to be a concoction of pills, the police rush to call an ambulance. On closer inspection, nobody else is in the house. But who are this couple that have been involved in a scene of absolute devastation?
It didn't take too long to really discover that Katherine Knight was a woman who was quite a strong personality, was quite strong physically, who was well known around the town, as a family were, and also to build a profile on the victim, John Price, as well, what sort of person he was.
John Price and Katherine Knight began a relationship 5 years earlier, in 1995. Price having been married before, and Knight coming from a string of failed relationships.
He was hard drinking, hard working, which sometimes doesn't always run in line with each other. He was always the first at work, irrespective of how much he drank the night before. He would be up and he would be at work doing his job, and normally the first one there. He was a bloke who loved a beer and a smoke, in the sense that, and that's what I enjoyed, I think, initially in his companionship with Katherine Knight. And that's what it was all about. Didn't want to have too many cares in the world, and I think when Katherine came along, she filled in that final little gap.
Their relationship was quickly established and frequently involved having a good time and socialising.
Their circle of friends were all of the same ilk. They were all fast-talking, swearing, tough people. They did use rough language. They did have rough, tough mannerisms. They were loud and they were boisterous, and when they were throwing a party, everybody knew about it.
But cracks soon began to appear.
She was quite a violent woman. She was quite highly strung. She was quite jealous with all of her partners, and she was, at times, was certainly quite vindictive in her actions against those partners, both physically and mentally.
This volatile nature displayed by Knight soon escalated, resulting in bizarre behaviour.
Everything's about revenge and entitlement with Katherine. She's like a B-grade movie in that respect. Percy had done the wrong thing by her. I think he tried to leave her once, or, you know, he'd been at the pub too long. So to get revenge, she got the video camera and she videoed a first aid kit she thought that he'd stolen from the mine, you know, I don't know, $20 first aid kit. She took the video of it to the mine's management. And Percy got sacked for it, lost his job over it.
That is a pretty catastrophic thing to do to a man. It's, you know, ending his livelihood, ending her livelihood as well. Again, that's the curious element of Katherine. She's quite happy to, you know, hurt even those like herself to get vengeance on somebody else. You know, she doesn't, there's no barrier for her that she won't cross. Percy's mates all said, mate, get rid of her, she's bad news. Things that she was saying and trying to set him up as having stolen, and in fact he hadn't stolen them at all. There was an out-of-date first aid kit that was at the mines which had been thrown out.
Despite what Knight had done to Price, this didn't signal the end of their relationship.
Percy threw her out for 3 months, but then he took her back. He lost a lot when he took her back. He'd already lost his job because of her. Then he lost respect of a lot of his mates because he'd taken her back. And his mates couldn't believe that he would do that. He couldn't drink at the pub. He had to change pubs because his mate said, you can't have her back in your life. What are you doing, you know? We've nursed you through the last lot of grief and here we go again, you know. So there's a sense of it all closing in on Percy. And when he makes that decision to get rid of her the last time, he knows it's not going to be easy, and I think it dawns on him pretty quickly that it's going to be really messy.
Knight was gradually striking fear into her partner, a fear that would culminate in Price resorting to desperate measures.
Percy had started to confide in his bosses that he was incredibly worried about what was going to happen. He told every time she thumped him or yelled at him or, you know, did something else, he rang a mate and said, this is what's happened. And he said, if something happens, I want you to be, you know, to bear witness to what's been going on with me for the last couple of years with this witch of a woman. In the meantime, this vengeful woman has called the police and they've arrived, and he said, I want her out of the house. And they said, you have to get a court order to get her out of the house, which infuriated him. It was his house. She didn't live there on a permanent basis.
In the last 36 hours, he knew something was up. He was trapped.
2 nights before he was killed, they'd had a row. She'd held a knife up at him, and he fled the house thinking that she's going to stab him. And he went over the road to his mates and said, you know, she's come at me with a knife. The next day, the police rocked back up to Percy's with an AVO that they, by law, had to take out on her behalf because she had called the police and she had accused him of being violent toward her.
Despite the restraining orders and involvement from the local police, Price chose to maintain contact with Knight. With the intimidation and violence escalating, it appears the local miner had a real sense of dread that his partner was capable of anything.
Monday, he goes into work and his boss can tell that this is a man who is clearly rattled. They hadn't seen him this rattled in all the time that they've been working with him. And they said, "Mate, what's up?" And he sat down and he told them what she had done, and he said to them, "I reckon she's going to do me in." The next day he went to court. This is the day that he was killed. He went to court and he sat down with the chamber magistrate and said, "This is what's happened." He told the magistrate that the night before at 2 a.m. in the morning, he's woken up and there she is standing at the foot of the bed with her hands behind her back. And he said he leapt out of bed. He was terrified. He thought she had a knife. He thought that was the night that she was going to do him in. And he said only when he got sort of closer to the mirror, he could see she had nothing behind her back, that, you know, the terror, the instant terror stopped. But he couldn't get her out of the house. She just would not go.
Despite legal notices served to both of them limiting contact, they seemed to ignore these, which was to result in devastating consequences. The day before his brutal murder, a final comment made by Price would send chills down the spines of everyone that knew him.
Price had gone over the road with 2 beers to see his mate and to tell his mate, "Mate, if you see my van out the front in the morning when you get up to go to work, call the cops. She's done me in."
As friends and relatives of John Price are trying to come to terms with his violent murder, the police need to establish how he met his death and who the culprit is. And everything so far is pointing directly to one person.
We started to get some statements from witnesses. We needed people who were close to the family, so we dealt mainly with the family of Katherine Knight and the family members of John Price.
As the investigation gets underway, Knight is kept under close supervision in hospital, suffering from the effects of the drugs she has taken.
Katherine Knight was basically in custody, but for some time she's going to be laid up. She's going to be possibly unconscious. That gave us a little bit of breathing space. We knew that we weren't going to get a chance to interview or even begin thoughts of interviewing Katherine Knight until she was completely well enough.
Whilst detectives wait to interview Knight to see what she will reveal, forensic investigators arrive to look for any clues that can determine what has actually happened in the house.
I got a phone call from VKG, which is police radio, telling us there'd been a murder. And I said to the operator, I said, "Well, how do you know it's a murder?" He said, "Well, he's been decapitated."
With the graphic description of how Price has been found, Peter Muscio is expecting a gruesome scene, but nothing can prepare him for what he is to see next.
We came in through the laundry at the back of the premises, and there's an aroma, and it was quite a macabre thing. It's a sweet odour, nice odour, as if Mum's cooking a stew.
Just like his colleagues before him, Peter is soon to discover the grim reality of the smell lingering in the kitchen. But he is first confronted with the rest of the killer's destruction.
Walk inside, and one of the first things you see is Mr. Price's skin or pelt hanging from the door, from a meat hook. I searched through the pelt for Mr. Price's genitals. Further into the kitchen, you could see blood staining on certain items. Into the lounge room, there was a body. Further down the hallway, there was blood staining down towards the bedrooms. You could see where I think Mr. Price has gone for the light switch. There's blood staining on the light switch, and also blood that he coughed or something onto the wall. You could see this expiration mark on it.
Analysing the scene, Peter tries to retrace Price's steps. The victim has firstly been attacked whilst lying in bed, then has tried to run for his life.
But as you go out towards the lounge room, this blood stain's getting heavier and heavier. Big swipes on the wall where he's blood-soaked himself and sliding against the wall. It's also getting lower, as if he's sort of... And it comes to culmination at the foyer where he's just succumbed to his injuries. He's actually opened the front door and there's blood spatter on the screen door, so he's nearly made it out. Not that it would have helped him, he would have died certainly, but you just see the enormity of where it starts in the bedroom and just progressively worse and worse till you get to that point where he's died. The blood pool, it was the width of the hallway, which is probably 1.2 metres wide.
John Price has been stabbed 37 times, and the attacker has shown no mercy, continuing with the most barbaric acts. As if the crime scene could not get any worse, Peter has the difficult task of examining the remains of the victim's body.
When we examined the body, you could see the body has been there in its entirety. There was a big stain on the floor where the head would have been. It's been skinned first. You can see where she'd placed the skin on the carpet to set it there, and it's quite a substantial staining. There's also an outline of the head, so she's then taken the head off there. You can see where she's walked in carrying it to the kitchen. There's a drip, 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 drip of blood all the way leading to the cooktop. But until we actually lifted the lid off, it wasn't confirmed.
The killer, having already decapitated and dismembered this man, hasn't stopped there, as the police are drawn to something else in the kitchen.
They go in and there's a meal on the table, for God's sake. There's vegetables, there's gravy, there's his meat, which he's cooked in the oven. If you saw it in a horror movie, you'd almost laugh because it's just so over the top. These are the things those coppers saw that day, and these are things that never leave them.
To me, they were a statement. She had cut, I think it's the glutamus maximus, the doc called it, off his backside. And it's a big muscle, and she's cut that into 5 different steaks, and she's cooked them, baked them in the oven. 2 of them were on one plate, 2 on another plate, and the 5th one was out for the dog, I believe. But it wasn't touched. But the meals were there like a trophy. They had the names of each person who was supposed to get them.
The names displayed with the meals are 2 of John Price's relatives, prepared and arranged, ready for them to come in and discover, but neither meal has been touched. Despite the confronting crime scene, Peter and his colleagues still have to gather what evidence they can.
In the kitchen, there was items that had been used. There was a jug with blood-stained handprint on it. So you collect that gets processed further back at the lab. A lot of the items were taken back, like the knives. There's a honing steel. There's also a sharpening stone. Like we had to get DNA material from all of those. There's a piece of cooked meat out on the backyard, so we collected that.
As the harrowing nature of what has happened begins to sink in, Bob Wells gets the chance to interview their prime suspect.
I got the opportunity to interview Katherine Knight about 5 days after the incident. Even though it was a lengthy interview, it didn't take us very far in relation to any admissions by Katherine.
Can't remember anything.
Do you recall yourself going to bed?
Faintly.
It was always maintained by Katherine during the interview that she couldn't remember anything.
Knight isn't giving anything away about what has happened. But in a lengthy interview, remarkably, she does accept that she has killed John Price.
Katherine presented me during that interview with this scenario that I needed to go and explore. That perhaps that she believes, or was claiming, that she committed this act because of the severe ongoing domestic violence she had incurred during her life, and more recently with John Price and other partners.
She has a rat cunning that she won't then go on and say, yes, this is why I did it. So she's never given the family piece, about why she did it. She's never been honest about it. You know, she blamed him by saying that he had been violent towards her.
As Bob Wells explores Knight's suggestions that she was in fact the victim of domestic abuse, more unbelievable details are revealed about the night before the murder, with Katherine taking others out for a meal.
Back at the daughter's house, she set up a video camera. She loved that video camera. And she started recording things. There's always a sense of entitlement with Katherine. There's a sense that I own this, I'm owed this, you know, this is mine. Almost like a will, that this is yours, don't let anyone take it from you.
It was quite bizarre. It was like a sort of she was leaving little bits and pieces of property, and it was sort of like a last will and testament of what Katherine was going to, wanted to portray.
She had been planning this for days. She watches a video, drives to Percy's home, wakes him up, watches a bit of Star Trek, has sex. She remembers him going for a pee, and then he lays back in bed, and then she strikes.
The slinky black negligee was later found to have sperm on it. It was found in the bathroom where we believe she showered. I believe we had samples taken from under a fingernail.
During the whole gruesome process, police believe Knight has washed, changed her clothing, and stolen her partner's wallet, before leaving the house to do other things.
We know that she'd left that crime scene at least once, and that was to take her car back to her home in McQueen Street and park it well up into the backyard, which is another indicator that, to us, that it was her possession, it was going to remain her possession. There was also the fact that Price's bank account had some money taken out at, I think, about 12:15 a.m. in two $500 lots, which we believe Katherine did at an ATM in Muswellbrook.
The money was never found. Where did it go? Did she take it somewhere and give it to somebody? Did she bury it somewhere?
The disappearance of large sums of money is just one mystery baffling the detectives. And now, days after the carnage, Bob Wells finally has the opportunity to ask pressing questions to their only suspect. But despite admitting to killing her partner, Knight presents an alibi that makes her the victim, not John Price.
Could it be the case that John Price was a victim of his own severe domestic and violence towards Katherine Knight, and she snapped and couldn't take it anymore? Which gave me the opportunity then to say that I then built the profile around Katherine Knight from the information she provided me during that interview. Interviewing the other partners, it became quite apparent that Katherine Knight, rather than being the victim of domestic violence, was more and more was the perpetrator of domestic violence in their relationships.
Katherine Knight had previous relationships with 3 other key men, marrying her first husband in 1974, meeting her second partner in 1986, and her third 4 years later in 1990. But would each partner reveal a similar pattern of behaviour experienced by Price?
These were blokes who were pulling the shirt across after they'd been stabbed by her. I mean, blokes who'd had their heads caved in with a frying pan, as Khaled had infamously. I can't imagine that many men are physically intimidated by their spouse. It must be a very small group. And it's even harder to imagine when blokes like these, hard Aussie blokes, but they lived in fear of their lives.
They had simple needs, beer at the end of, a hard working day, a woman who was there for them at home, and, somewhere nice to stay. So it was really quite extraordinary. She wasn't a great intellectual. She wasn't the sharpest pencil in the box by any standard. She didn't have great sort of, conversational skills up at the pub where she'd go. She just had this allure about the sex. She didn't care when she crossed the line. That was the whole thing. She was completely without remorse when she would do these terrible things. She would go back and ask these men to come back to her, but it wasn't oh, I'm really sorry for what I did. It was basically, oh, come on, come back, we've got to stay together.
As more unravels about this volatile woman, it is clear her irrational behaviour started when she was young.
With Dave Callett, they certainly had their ups and downs, but their relationship lasted a while. He was the first one to get the hint of how violent she was, and it apparently happened on the wedding night when she tried to throttle him because she'd heard some story that on wedding night Mum and Dad had had sex, X plus 6 times, and poor old Callett conked out after 3 goes or something because he'd been drinking for 2 days. I think he was smart enough to know that the only way he was getting out of that relationship alive was to run away, and he did. She placed the first child on the railway tracks where the coal trains go through. That was all in response to Callett leaving her. This is probably the first public demonstration of just how excessive Katherine could be.
Endangering her baby's life landed Knight in a psychiatric unit, an extreme measure that drove Kellett to change his mind about the relationship and go back to her. But this didn't last for long. In 1986, Knight met David Saunders, a local miner.
They were madly in love in the early days, but like all of Katherine's relationships, the honeymoon period generally lasted 1 year to 18 months. It didn't last much longer than that. And in her mind, it would always be that they're cheating on me, even when they weren't, or that they're not spending enough time with me.
And Knight's irrational nature exploded in the most disturbing way.
He went out and cut his dog's throat.
Was the dog dead?
It was a clean cut, they said.
Katherine Mary Knight from Aberdeen in New South Wales has just admitted to murdering her partner, John Price. But instead of revealing what she has done and why, she is instead claiming to be the victim of domestic abuse. However, investigations into her past are revealing a very different story, as Bob Wells tracks down previous partners.
One of them has been stabbed in the stomach with scissors. She's sliced a puppy's neck, killing a young puppy at 8 weeks old because she was cranky. I mean, they just went back time and time again.
Saunders had to run away and hide. When he left her, he hid in another town. He pretended he was somewhere else. He put up this elaborate facade.
After that relationship broke down, Knight soon moved on to her next with a former co-worker in the local abattoir.
She left John Chillingworth, She said, I don't want you, and she cheated on him with one of her other partners in between, So it's kind of like, I think she was just getting to that point where she was desperate. Her looks were leaving her, such as they were. There was not that many options around in town. I think most of the menfolk of Aberdeen and the Hunter Valley had got her measure by now. They knew of her reputation. They knew that, she wasn't shy with, landing a fist on their face or, stabbing them with whatever implement she could get.
This window into her checkered past is now revealing a woman who has resorted to extreme violence throughout her life, often with no remorse or consequences. Separate to her volatile relationships, an insight into her personal and professional life may also shed light onto her unusual character.
Aberdeen's, in its early stages, was a farming area with a large abattoirs where Katherine worked.
Knight had worked in the local slaughterhouse for years, starting as a general labourer in 1971. It was not long before she progressed to the offal room, working on animal carcasses before honing her skills as a meat slicer in the boners room. This was her trade for over a decade. But could her diligence at work have masked or encouraged something more sinister?
She had an obsession with death. She loved to nick arteries in the abattoir and scrape the marrow out. I mean, who loves working in an abattoir, for God's sake?
She had this fascination with knives, and it was quite apparent that she could handle a knife.
This morbid fixation with the macabre side of life is also evident when officers search Knight's own home, just down the road from Price's in Aberdeen.
It was quite a bizarre premises, and we found that Katherine had a severe fascination with violent and bizarre movies, which she retained on VHS. The house that she owned is just full of macabre stuffed animals. It's quite a dark, gloomy house. It didn't give you a feeling that it was ever vibrant, open and light.
And extensive police inquiries with family members reveal some shocking warning signs from Knight. Could the writing have been on the wall for some time?
Katherine was workshopping the crime in her own mind and, just dropping hints to the family here and there.
There was information from her brother that she did say those particular words, that she would kill Pricey, and she'd get away with it because they'd think she was mad. There was other comments, if Pricey takes me back, he takes me back till the death.
With these admissions, along with all the other evidence, would Knight admit to her barbaric act in court? Less than 1 year on from the death of John Price, his family and friends must face seeing her in court.
At no time, either as a barrister or as a judge, did I ever strike anything of the horrific nature of Katherine Mary Knight's case. She pleaded not guilty, and the trial began in the conventional way. She sat in the dock. She was quite small, unimpressive. In a crowd, you would certainly never notice her.
Despite admitting to killing her partner during the police interview, Knight still enters a not guilty plea. But as a trial commences, she sensationally does a U-turn and asks to change the plea to guilty, but doesn't give a reason.
I was somewhat nervous about this because I was concerned that if I took a guilty plea, sentenced her, she would then appeal to the Court of Criminal Appeal and say she was insane at the time that she made the plea of guilty. I decided that I should get a court expert to examine her. And the psychiatrist came to exactly the same conclusion as the other psychiatrist that had seen her, namely that she was not insane, she was quite sane, but she was a bad woman.
Remarkably, despite the severity of Price's injuries, Knight has carried out this sustained and calculated attack with a sane mind. However, the court does reveal something else about Knight.
3 psychiatrists all diagnosed her with a personality disorder, which is not a psychiatric illness. It's actually it's a disorder of the way you relate to other people, and that's what she was like. If she didn't get her own way, if you crossed her, or if she imagined that you had, done something or said something about her, she would get payback.
Justice Barry O'Keefe allows a guilty plea and the jury is dismissed. But the graphic evidence is still heard.
Throughout the whole of the evidence, it didn't matter what a witness said, she didn't look at the witness. It didn't matter what the photograph or the video was, she didn't look at that. She sat looking straight ahead, absolutely impassive. There was never a sign on her face of any reaction to any of the evidence.
There was one time, and I believe it was when either they were describing the crime scene, or it might have even been the crime scene tape, where she started rocking violently backwards and forwards and wailing and falling on the floor and really carrying on a treat.
This outburst is in stark contrast to the killer's usual measured behaviour. But Knight knows exactly what she is doing.
When she wanted an adjournment, she manipulated her behaviour so that she got it. Thereafter, she resumed the same mien as she'd had before, but I didn't think she'd switched off.
Eventually, in a highly charged courtroom, the judge reveals the sentence to be handed to this killer.
To sentence any person to life imprisonment is a big thing. To sentence a woman to life imprisonment, for me, was an even bigger thing. This was as bad a case as you got, so she had to go to jail for the term of her life.
Katherine Mary Knight is the first female in Australia to be sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole.
Today she became the first woman to be jailed for life under truth in sentencing laws, ensuring she'll die behind bars. She's been branded a danger to the community, capable of murdering anyone who crosses her.
She'd shown no remorse. She had not acknowledged that she had any problem at all. Such a person, if released, is not unlikely to do the same again. There's the real prospect of it.
There was a lot of cheering by family members and those sorts of things. But I was quite happy that, that we'd done a successful job and that justice was done in the end and that Katherine Knight got what she deserved. The little unturned stone for me is that the missing link from Katherine not saying and filling in that gap. When I was interviewing Katherine, you can catch someone's eye and you say to yourself, I'm being bullshitted to here. It's a combination of catching their eye, catching the expression on their face, that you know that this person is feeding you only what she wants to feed you. And that's why I still believe that Katherine would now be able to provide information as to what took place and why it took place.
Knight failed in an appeal of her sentence and will never be released. She takes to prison many secrets as to her motivation and reasons for ending someone else's life so brutally. And the mystery of Price's missing money on the night of his death still remains.
Katherine Knight doesn't make mistakes. She doesn't do things by accident. She has a well thought out plan and she executes it the way she wants to.
I can tell you that I found this a very stressful matter. In fact, after it was over, I didn't eat meat for about 3 months. The thought of meat reminded me of the events in this house.
She's not just a woman who's capable of violence or a woman who's capable of murder. She's a woman who revelled in this macabre, sinister, disgusting behaviour that is off the scale, that we cannot permit in a civilised society.